Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So Donald Trump, the President of the United States, has been making comments about an imaginary border and an artificial border, about this treaty from 1909 and that thing from whatever. So I thought, you know what? Let's take a big step back and let's get an expert on the Canadian-U.S. border. So I reached out to Benjamin Hoy, who is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. He actually has a PhD from Stanford University. So he's been in academia on both sides of the border, and he's an expert on the Canadian-U.S. border and on how borders are made. And he's actually written not only about the Canada-U.S. border, but about border issues in regards to Indigenous people and other things. And so, Professor, help us here. Is this an artificial imaginary border? How did it come to be? We've had people talk about Point Roberts. We've had people talk about somewhere in Atlantic Canada that's not accessible. We've talked about someone actually drew this diagram about how almost all of southwestern Ontario might be carved off. What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, right?
Crazy.
To understand this, right, you got to go back to the 1860s, 1890s when they're building this border really for the first time. Like, there's pieces of it that are earlier than that in 1812, 1815, 1775. It's a long process, right? I think that maybe that's one of the most important things is borders take a long time to build, hundreds of years, and they're complicated because hundreds of people, for very different reasons, build them, right? So you talked about an imaginary border, right? And all borders are imaginary in some sense, right? They don't follow mountain lines. They don't follow rivers necessarily. Like they built our border across the 49th parallel, especially where I am in the West, because they didn't understand the lands that they were trying to govern, right? And it's easy to pick a line that just follows abstract lines of latitude, longitude. It's a lot harder to build a border in a place that you know.
Okay, so give us the history. How did the 49th parallel come to pass?
Yeah, so the most sort of obvious moment is the United States separating from Britain. And suddenly, for the first time, you need a division that makes sense between two nations that have just finished a pretty bloody and pretty devastating war. And so they're sort of hashing out some of these early ideas and these early policies. You get the Jay Treaty and some of these other pieces that are being referenced in the media now. And then in the 1812, right, you have another war between Britain, Canada, and the United States. And following that, you get most of the border being set. They pick the 49th parallel in large part because they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know this land. This is Cree land. This is Blackfoot land, right? This is all Indigenous land that they're projecting that one day they might want to go out and control, especially for Canada. And then, there's this long gap, especially in the West, right? In BC, in the prairies, where they don't have settlers on the ground. So they've drawn this treaty, and now you need to go out and you need to make this border real. And that's the hard part, right? Like I could go out today and claim that I make a new country, say the Republic of Hoy, and I'm going to claim part of France, right? I can sign treaties. I just need to find another group of people who will recognize them. But the hard part is actually going out and surveying it and then enforcing it. And so in the 1870s, they send surveyors out into the prairies and start surveying it. They send them in the 1850s, 1860s out into BC. And this is crazy hard work. So you think of BC, right? Mountains, forests, right? And so you're going out into lands that you do not know well with complicated astronomical equipment so you can tell where you are in space. And you need to mark the border. So you're carrying these stone pillars. They're carrying 50,000 shingles with them. They're carrying doors and windows, like the things that you need to actually survive the winter in fairly cold places. And they're cutting a line through the trees. And trees have this awful habit of growing back.
Growing back.
So yeah, right? So you have to keep investing in this border. In the prairies, right, they're putting these monuments, these sort of piles of stones every time they find the border. And the bison love them. Just love them. They rub up against them, they knock them over. So every 10 years, they have to send another set of surveyors out to remark the border. And it's expensive. It's the U.S. side alone takes 100,000 days worth of labor just to mark from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains.
Hold it, 100,000 days?
100,000 days worth of labor just for the U.S. side, right? That's carrying building canoes, building places to stay. That's cutting trees. That's astronomical equipment. Just that section takes many, many years just to survey, and we're not even talking about guarding it, right? It's crazy how hard it is to build a border. And that's the easy one. The harder one is the prairies, right? That's the one they do last. We think of borders as sort of going east to west, but they go east, then the Pacific coast, and then the prairies, because the prairies is so hard. It's so cold. They're not even convinced that there's going to be enough water to survive. It tells you sort of how little they know about the land that they're claiming. So it's really expensive. Really, really expensive. You have to really want a border. And the reason they do is because they think it will help them solve problems, right? Why would you spend all of this money? And these are small governments at this time, way smaller than ours today, many times smaller. And so there's different things that you might want a border for. And this, I guess, gets back to your first question about Trump is, why would you want one? Well, in the 19th century, governments don't make their money off of income taxes. They make their money off borders.
Off Trump's favorite word, tariff.
Yeah, tariffs. Yeah, right. And so you can actually map these tariffs, and you can map the sort of incentives. All of the customs agents along the Canada-U.S. border, when they're first, in the 19th century, when they're first building it, are on the St. Lawrence River, right? A conduit of trade with Europe. They're on the eastern seaboard, so the Maritimes, and then to a lesser extent, they're on British Columbia. So almost all of the border that exists today, they're not making tariffs on, right? So it's easy to sort of justify enforcement.
Easy to circumvent the border and the tariff.
Super easy. And that's one of the problems with this. That's one of the reasons we abandon this style of tax, right? When you make tariffs your primary way of making money as a government, you make it really, really valuable to circumvent the border, right? And it's really hard to guard this border. It's too long. Even today with satellites and infrared, people cross the border all the time. And the challenge is you don't want to waste more money enforcing the border than you are bringing money in. And so there's a really delicate balance, especially when tariffs are a big thing, for where do you guard and how hard do you guard? So
it sounds like you're saying it is an imaginary border now, or an artificial border. Let's talk about some specifics. I understand that at one point in time, Canada or I guess Britain at the time was claiming that the border on the West Coast should be the 42nd parallel, not the 49th parallel. What happened such that the Treaty of Oregon or something like this, we lost 7 points of latitude? What happened there?
Yeah, so this is part of the uncertainty. So in the 1840s, no one is sure where the border is going to run through sort of Washington and British Columbia. And there's a bunch of different lines that are being conceived of. It's hard to remember this now, but when the United States takes Alaska in the 1860s, it's with the idea that one day it will connect to Washington State, that British Columbia will be part of the US. And when you think about that, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? It's no longer this sort of abstract piece of land located far away from the mainland United States. They're going to try and control the entire Pacific Northwest. And so there's a bunch of competing claims. Britain wants a much lower line. The United States wants a much higher line. The line that they sort of end up negotiating it's sort of this awkward agreement. But I think the sort of key is how much of this land is in flux, and how tied to pieces of land people get. So you mentioned Point Roberts earlier. It makes no sense, right? You have this peninsula where people have to take their kids up into Canada from Washington State. drive across Canada and then drop down back into the United States to send their kids to school, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's other places, other enclaves, the Northwest Angle and whatnot come to mind. But the diplomats who are signing these treaties, it's sort of anathema to them to give up even a sliver of land. And so these battles are pretty fierce. The other one that happens on the Pacific coast is over the path through the Strait of San Juan de Fuca. There's a bunch of islands, and the treaties, because they're signing these treaties without any knowledge of what the land looks like, they don't really know where to put this border. And so when the surveyors arrive, they have to pick one of 3 different channels in that case. So it's this weird and confusing story where they sign these treaties that are like half a page in size, and then someone has to go out and make this a real thing.
So in 1846, we lost all of Washington State and ceded it to the United States by way of this Treaty of Oregon.
That's a bit more confusing because this is all indigenous lands, right? Right. Both countries are claiming lands that are not their lands. And so it's complicated, I guess, right? It's, you're trading agreements. So the United States would say that they gave up a bunch of land to Canada. Britain will say that it gave up a bunch of land to the United States. But the real people who are losing the land are the people who practically controlled it, which are the indigenous nations on the West Coast, right? This is their land.
Good point.
Right? And so one of the reasons that both countries want to sign the border agreement and clarify quickly is they need to sign separate treaties with all of those indigenous nations. Right? And what they don't want to do is they don't want to double pay for land. Right? They don't want to sign a treaty with one indigenous group like the Stalo and then have the other country sign a separate agreement with the Stalo and muddle control. So the first thing they do is do the national border before they have really a great sense of what the land looks like in practice. And then they follow that up with the treaties that actually matter, which are the ones with indigenous nations.
Okay, let's flip to Eastern Canada and the border between Quebec and Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, etc. For most of Ontario, the border is in the middle of the Great Lakes and along the St. Lawrence River. Why does it deviate when you go into Quebec, south of the St. Lawrence? And how did that boundary between New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine and Quebec get established?
Yeah, so most of my work is Ontario West. So I don't know the Quebec story nearly as much, but there are a series of very complicated challenges. A lot of the treaties and problems with that border are inherited from the French and others. So a sort of classic example of this is the French sign a bunch of treaties about the path of the border following the St. Croix River, right? And so when Britain sort of takes over that territory, it has to figure out where that river is. And they have reams of documents, hundreds and hundreds of pages. But the French have this awful habit of naming all of their rivers the St. Croix River. And so there's like 10 different rivers that this border could go down. And it's this crazy moment in time where neither the British nor the French know where this border should run. The US doesn't know where the border should run. And they actually turn to the Passamaquoddy community, a local indigenous community, to figure out treaties that were signed by distant European powers, but the Passamaquoddy knowledge keepers have knowledge about where the French actually were operating that they share with the British. And that's part of the reason that the border takes the St. Croix River as the one that they follow. So when the boundary negotiators arrive, they actually have to rely on indigenous knowledge to figure it out. And the same happens in Ontario at the Lake of the Woods. They have this key boundary monument, and everything is based on this monument. If you can't find this monument, you can't survey the border. And they built it decades ago in the Lake of the Woods. I don't know. Do you know the Lake of the Woods at all?
I do.
It's wild, right? It's got water everywhere. Every year the boundaries change. It has fires. And so you're looking for this oak post in the middle of this enormous lake that got lit on fire and is now buried like 6 feet into the mud, and you need to find it. You can't do it without it.
That's the border?
That's the start of the border, right? That's the monument that the rest of the border is going to be traced onto. And again, they can't find it, and so they turn to Indigenous people to find that monument because they've kept sort of memories and moments from this time period. And so we think of these borders as being signed just between two countries, but they have to do it with Indigenous people, right? This is their land. This is land that they know, and neither country knows it well enough, even in the treaties that they signed, to do it on their own.
The going back to the border in eastern Canada between Quebec and Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, we also have the issue between New Brunswick and Maine, and I understand that was under dispute for quite a long time as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with borders. Borders try and draw an artificial divide between communities, right? People cross the border for lumber, which is one of the sort of big disputes that's going to happen in the East. You have uncertainty on whether borders will shift over time. A lot of you see this in how the American states are built initially. They have these sort of amorphous descriptions of what their state is going to contain that goes deep into the West. And so, it's worth sort of keeping in mind that while the border hasn't changed a whole lot in recent years, when it's being built, there's this enormous amount of uncertainty, of possibility that's happening. And some of that, like I said, is because people have this awful habit of moving around and taking economic opportunities on both sides of the border. And so in practice, this is where historians talk about borderlands, but it just, in a simple way, is just a description of there's this line that divides people, but that doesn't stop them crossing the border for baseball games or for working in auto manufacturing.
Or libraries. We have libraries.
Or libraries. Yeah, you have theaters that are split in half by the border, right? It gets this enormously complicated world really, really quickly.
So tell me about the Arctic as well, because I understand that, number one, the border between, Canada and Alaska has also been at dispute, but also, very importantly, where the line exists in the Arctic Ocean north of Alaska and Canada is in dispute. Tell me about borders in waterways or an ocean.
Yeah, so borders in waterways are wild. So on land, you can put down markers, right? But in water, that's a little bit harder to do. In the 19th century, you would actually see the border in a really tangible way from the water only because of the different laws. So in the BC-Washington border, sort of the south of where you're talking about, the US allowed fish traps and Canada did not. And so the only way that you could tell where the border was without astronomical equipment was to look for these fish traps. So yeah, I mean, people get lost all the time at sea. And it's one of the persistent challenges with making a maritime border is how do you tell that someone's smuggling or just lost, right? A storm rolls in, your ship drifts a couple miles, you're suddenly on the wrong side of the border without any intention of crossing. How do you separate someone like that from someone who's intentionally smuggling? In the Arctic, they build that border like they do many in the sort of West, with treaties that are signed where they have no idea of what they're doing or what the geography looks like. And when you don't know what you're doing, you either do a line of latitude, or in the Arctic's case, you're like, well, I see this very large mountain range. We're just going to run the border right down the middle of that, which is easy to do and really hard to survey. Like these poor surveyors are going up there and being like, I need to find the tallest point of each of these mountains, which is, like, you can imagine, an awful job. You're just climbing up and down mountains, trying to figure out which one has the tallest peak, and setting the border so that you're following this complicated mountain range. So all of that is really, really, really tricky. Easy to write down on a treaty, really hard to survey. And so that border sort of languishes for many, many years until something valuable comes around. And in the Arctic's case, that would be gold. And then it becomes really, really important where exactly that border goes, because it sets the ports that you can pull gold from. And so that's sort of that moment where suddenly both countries care very deeply about that border. And it'll start to matter again
With oil.
with oil. It'll matter again with the Cold War. Suddenly you want to know what's American space, where you're going to put American installations. Will Canada allow installations up north? And now you have this concern or this opportunity about what about a sort of northern path through the sea, right? Suddenly that becomes really, really appealing if you can get ships through there. And it's one of those moments where the border becomes important because it has something to offer.
Sounds like you're almost agreeing with Donald Trump that it's sort of artificial imaginary. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with our expert on border, Ben Hoy, I apologize, who is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, an expert on borders. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Donald Trump has been talking a lot about borders between Canada and the United States. And so I thought it would be really good to get Ben Hoy, who is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, an expert on borders and the historical context of borders, on to give us some grounding. You were just talking about the Northwest Passage before our break, and I wonder if you could talk about that. My very rudimentary geography knowledge is that we've got, lots of islands that we think are Canada, both below to the south of and above to the north of what's called the Northwest Passage. And so I would have thought that the Northwest Passage is in Canada, but it's being claimed international waters by not only the United States, but China and Russia. So what's the rule on borders when you've got international passageways between islands?
Yeah, so it's not something that I specialize in at all, but it is complicated, and these are super contested. China's been contesting areas for a long time. And one of the strategies around this is that you place small installations on islands to project your sovereignty into the waters around them. So the UN has specific rules about the authority extended from a place. So if an island's yours, there's a certain number of miles or kilometers away that is sort of your exclusive area, and then your control in a number of different, each level past that sets another boundary with a certain set of rules. And so one of the strategies is you put military installations or you put small groups of people out into areas that you want to project your power from. It doesn't need to be a lot of people often, but it gets to be this sort of crazy and somewhat silly game where your goal is to control territorial waters. But a lot of this is posturing. A lot of this is an attempt to control something that I think by most accounts should be Canadian. But like I said, this is not something that I'm a specialist in.
The ownership of critical minerals and and oil and things like that have to do with borders and continental shelf. Can you explain that at all?
Not too much. No, not with the kind of specificity that you'd need.
So I think that's an issue as well that's come up, and we need to understand that better. Okay, let's go back to Alaska. So the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia, and why did it have this panhandle that comes down, down west of the west coast of British Columbia? To the extent, was that purchased from Russia? Was that Russian territory, or was that disputed territory?
This is sort of the complicated part of this. Is like I said, the U.S. is inheriting a border that Russia negotiated earlier, and the modern Canadian-U.S. border follows that pretty closely. And all of the people who are signing these treaties don't know this area, and so most of the border ends up just following the spine of the mountain. But in a lot of ways, what you care about in the 19th century is the coastal waters anyways. That's your connection to the Pacific. That's your connection. We think of oceans today as barriers, right? They sort of stop things. But in the 19th century, oceans are your mode of transit. Today, they still are how you move large amounts of goods. And so what you don't want the interior. The interior, maybe it's useful, maybe it's not. If you find gold, it's useful. But what you want are the coastal waters. And so that panhandle is extremely valuable in that sense. It's important for restocking ships. It's important for port access. So it seems sort of as a weird appendage, but that's fairly valuable territory.
Now, the U.S. border also changed fairly dramatically on the southern side, where they purchased, a lot from Mexico or from Spain at one point in time. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so they'll take parts from the Louisiana Purchase. They will invade and take a lot of it's Comanche land, but also California, a lot of the Southwest. The U.S. will take from Spain or Mexico.
Now, you specialize a lot also in indigenous issues in regards to the border. And I guess there's indigenous groups that are on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border. How does, this whole issue about artificial borders interplay with indigenous issues?
Yeah, so it makes things really, really messy. So these indigenous nations, right, they're sovereign people. You'll see over time how Canada, U.S. sort of think about this changes. But there's many groups who are just split in two. Their traditional lands are quite large, and this can have pretty substantial impacts for different groups' ability to receive treaty recognition, to access ceremonial places or plants, to visit relatives and friends, and for economic employment. So this happens for the Six Nations in Ontario. This will happen for many of the groups in BC and the prairies. It happened to the groups in Minnesota. One of the advantages of the border for these groups is it gives them some options. Right? If they get really frustrated with one country, at least in the 19th, early 20th century, some of them will relocate across the border. So a good example of this is 1885, the Northwest Resistance. Little Bear's community will actually cross into the United States, and today many of them are part of Rocky Boy, the Rocky Boy Reserve. The Dakota, after 1862, there's a war with the United States. They'll cross into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and only a couple years ago finally got federal recognition in the way they probably should have had a century ago. So there is a risk, right? Crossing these borders carries a risk, but it also allows you to avoid, in the Dakotas case, a tremendous amount of violence that was being brought against them by the United States.
So, I read this article once that said that the border should have been on the 42nd parallel versus the 49th parallel. And if it was on the 42nd parallel, that is more natural, given where numerous different indigenous communities had their normal lands. And the Dakota was one of the major examples where the Dakota would have been primarily north of the 42nd parallel rather than split on both sides of the border. What do you think of that?
There's always going to be an arbitrariness to where you draw a border, right? You can have them follow rivers, but as the U.S.-Mexico border shows, rivers move. They have this awful habit of moving over time. And does the border follow the river? What if someone diverts the river? Right? You can follow mountains, and that's fine, but mountains don't crisscross an entire country the way you might want. Borders are human creations, right? People build them and they rebuild them in hundreds of different ways for often political purposes. They're used to control resources. And the weirdest part about a border is the first thing that you do when you build a border is you give up some of your own power. The old way that people used to do borders was this there's sort of a nucleus of power, and then as you move away from whatever core city, power is more diffuse. Our modern conceptions of borders are different. At this line, my power stops completely. My legal system stops. My ability to pass laws stop. It's never perfect, but it's kind of weird in that sense, as if crossing 10 feet should make this incredible difference, right? That's an administrative division, but it's not a division between cultures. It's not always a division between people.
So if you were invited to the Oval Office and you had the chance to sit down against across the table from Donald Trump, and he said this is an arbitrary, artificial border, what would you tell him?
In some ways, he's correct about that, and probably that is the only thing. Borders are arbitrary to some extent. They are human creations. But it's also a border that's been respected for 150 years. It's baffling to try and throw away all of the goodwill, all of the mutual support. Borders require two countries to work together to build them. And it's baffling to try and destroy all of that work and all of the institutions that were built to manage this really complicated place. In the 1920s, they realized that they couldn't just build the border on their own and have one side try and guard it. That it was just a disaster. It didn't work, that you needed bipartisan support. And so they built a lot of these institutions, these tribunals, to deal with what happens when two ships crash into each other right on the border. Right? All of these sort of fringe cases, you needed cooperation. Canada early on would allow American customs agents to operate in Canada because it made things more administratively simple. Right? Cooperation is the core of any border creation. Right? Unless you want to do something like North Korea, South Korea, where you just fill the borderlands with landmines, you need both countries to work together. And so it's baffling to throw away 150 years of cooperation for what? What the U.S. gains in this trade war with these tariffs is so small to what they potentially are giving up.
A 5,500 mile and 8,800 kilometer border between Canada and the United States that's been respected for, as you say, 150 years. And all of a sudden, a new president calls it artificial, imaginary, and wants to erase it. Unbelievable. Ben Hoyt, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This has been helpful.
Thanks so much.
That's an interesting discussion about the Canadian-U.S. border from a historical, geographical standpoint. Mm-hmm. And I think that Professor Hoy deals with it even more so from an Indigenous standpoint. And, that's a topic that we should come back and chat with about him in the future, because I think that's a real important issue. But for now, we got to decide. Are we going to stand firm, or are we going to give in to some of his taunts? Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes.